The rain drizzled against the window as I stared blankly at the passing landscape. The gray skies outside mirrored the way I felt inside. It had been months since I'd felt anything remotely close to happiness. Each day seemed to blend into the next, and I couldn't remember the last time I looked forward to something. Life had become a monotonous cycle of work, sleep, and endless thoughts that weighed heavily on my heart. I boarded the train, as I always did, taking a seat by the window. I preferred it that way-less interaction, more time to be alone with my thoughts. The rhythmic hum of the train usually provided a sense of detachment, a temporary escape from reality. I would watch the trees blur past, counting minutes, until I reached my destination, only to repeat the same routine. The next day, as I settled into my seat, a voice broke through my silent world. "Mind if I sit here?" I glanced up to see a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a warm smile. He was dressed in a slightly worn-out brown coat and carried a small leather briefcase. Despite his modest appearance, there was a calm confidence about him. I nodded, and he took the seat beside me. He seemed cheerful, the kind of person who could find joy in the smallest of things. I envied him. "Nice weather, huh?" he said, glancing at the rainy scene outside. I shrugged. "Not really. In the mood for small talk, I guess." "You don't like the rain?" I sighed. "I don't really like much these days." He nodded, as if he understood completely. "Life can feel like that sometimes. But perspective changes everything." I turned to him, curiosity creeping in. "Perspective," he smiled. "Yes, you see, I used to hate the rain too. It reminded me of all the sad days in my life. But then, one day, I met a little girl at a bus stop. She was jumping in puddles, laughing, and she told me, 'Rain is just the sky giving the earth a hug.' That stuck with me. Since then, I try to see things differently." I couldn't help but smile, even if it was faint. "That's a nice way to look at it." The man nodded. "You see, sometimes we're too focused on the negatives that we miss the beauty in the simplest things." He paused before continuing. "Are you going through something tough?" I hesitated, but eventually nodded. "Yeah, you could say that. I get it," he said softly. "Life isn't easy. I've had my fair share of struggles too. Lost my job a few years ago, went through a rough divorce, and for a while I felt like I had nothing left. But then I started talking to people, strangers even, and I realized I wasn't alone." "We're never really alone." His words settled in my mind like a soothing balm. I had been feeling so isolated, but perhaps he was right. Maybe I wasn't alone in my struggles. "So, what did you do?" I asked, genuinely interested now. "I started appreciating the little things," he replied. "Every morning I'd list 3 things I was grateful for. Some days it was as simple as a warm cup of coffee or a kind smile from a stranger. Slowly, I began to realize that life still had good in it. I nodded, feeling a flicker of hope that actually sounds doable. "It is," he said with a grin, "and it helps. You might be surprised at how much beauty there is when you start looking for it." The train slowed to a stop, and the man stood up, grabbing his briefcase. "This is my stop. It was nice talking to you. Remember, sometimes all it takes is a little change in perspective." I watched him leave, feeling a strange sense of warmth in my chest. For the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe, just maybe, things could get better. That evening, as I sat down with my usual cup of tea, I took out a notebook and wrote down 3 things I was grateful for. The rain, for reminding me of a fresh start. The stranger on the train, for his kindness. And myself, for still holding on. Little by little, day by day, my perspective started to shift. I found myself smiling more, appreciating the world around me, and even talking to people. The stranger on the train had been right. I wasn't alone, and life was still full of moments worth cherishing. Months passed, and I began to notice more things around me: the laughter of children. In the park, the scent of fresh coffee. In the morning, the vibrant colors of the sunrise. Life wasn't perfect, but it was beautiful in its own way. One evening, I boarded the train again and found myself next to an elderly woman who looked tired and distant. I could see the weight of the world on her shoulders, the same way it once sat on mine. I smiled at her and said, "Mind if I sit here?" She nodded, and as the train began to move, I reached into my pocket and handed her a small piece of paper with the same words: "That changed my life. You are not alone, and life is still beautiful."